Hello, welcome to this video. I'm going to talk about the Europe-America relations in the past. In the past, I would say at least 2 decades, but particularly in the past year or so, we're seeing a lot of surprising amount of tension and conflict, which I think if you imagine like even 5 years ago, would be shocking. The idea that an American president is saying we need to invade, take over what is, I know it's kind of geographically in the middle between Europe and America, but it is officially a European territory. I'm talking of Greenland here, of course. And then Europe actually sending troops, a very small number, only a few dozen, but to Greenland, and then sanctions being declared on each other's goods back and forth. It is. I know it's not extreme. It's not World War III or anything, but it is a surprisingly fast turn in the breakdown of U.S.-European relations. And some people will just say, well, this is just Trump acting crazy. And I think actually, no, that this was a long time coming. This relates to something much, much deeper and fundamental, a kind of deeper and fundamental conflict of values, or conflict of interest, or geopolitical sort of historical breakup that is emerging. And I want to discuss this not by giving you all of these slop videos and arguments about Greenland, and it has these minerals, and reducing everything like to an economist, like so many people do today on the internet, just talking about everything that's valuable as if it's just a fight over some precious metals or natural resources, or some very basic strategic geostrategic benefits. It's very clear that actually the U.S. could have easily arranged these security agreements with Denmark, inside or outside of an invasion. This is like not necessary, right? You can easily have more American cooperation. There's already a base there. You can have more American cooperation in Greenland. That wouldn't be something which has been offensive or has been a problem for the Danish government for decades. This is not a issue. So clearly there's something more going on here, other than just basic security concerns or even fights over resources. And I'm going to discuss this by reading a few passages from Carl Schmitt's Nomos of the Earth. So in particular, this is the section where Schmitt will talk about the Monroe doctrine and the US's kind of isolation and separation from Europe historically, because of course the Monroe doctrine came in the early 19th century, and its basic kind of premise was to separate itself from Europe more officially, and to declare a complete zero tolerance for any European interference or colonialization of the American hemisphere, of the American continent. This was the period where the term, which is now very familiar to us, was originally coined, the Western Hemisphere. So I'm going to read a few paragraphs and pages from this section, and I'm going to just comment on it and give some further analysis. Okay, so Schmitt says, the term Western Hemisphere still has a global political and historical content in international law that goes far beyond its mathematical geographical borders. In the spheres of politics and international law, it has its own sources of power and, consequently, also its own internal boundaries. Concealed within these boundaries is its arcanum, i.e., the secret of its undeniable historical effect. The Western Hemisphere is part of the great historical tradition and is linked to very specific phenomena of modern global and historical consciousness. By comparison with the two previous types of global lines, reyes and amnesty, it is the most important example of what we have called the global linear thinking of Occidental rationalism. Just to explain reyes and amnesty quickly, reyes is a term which I think Schmitt came up with, and it means the spatial legal division established to manage conflict, which came about during European imperial expansion. So a lot of this is a lot of what we're talking about here is basically in the context of the aftermath of the original European expansion. European nations, of course, were the first to go on these very grandiose global expansions in seacraft and creating colonies in other countries. And these created what Schmitt would call land appropriating politics. So this is the politics of, like, you have these European nations and there's a sort of fixed spatial order which is already in place. This order began with the res publica Christiana, which was the medieval kind of geopolitical order. So when we say order here, we're talking about a kind of geopolitical spatial order, which deals with points of conflict between these different kingdoms. And then later you have the Jus Publicum Europaeum, which is the new order which starts to begin to emerge once these expansions begin to occur. So you have these expansions begin to occur in the for the kind of 17th century onwards. And these are all the colonial outposts, we could say, of the European nations. And you have a new order. And then after this order, then this is what Schmitt is now getting to. You have this new moment in the historical geopolitical history, which is labeled like the Western Hemisphere. And he's trying to describe basically something which emerged originally with the Monroe doctrine, and then created a new chapter in this story of geopolitical spatial evolution, we could say. With that in mind, let's keep reading. The American line of Western Hemisphere is neither a reo nor a amnesty line. All previous mentioned lines concerned a land appropriation, but in President Monroe's 1823 pronouncement, the American line rejected European claims to land appropriations. From the American perspective, this line at first had a defensive character directed at the powers of old Europe. It was a protest against further European land appropriations on American soil. It is easy to see that the line thus gave the United States freedom to appropriate land on its own behalf, i.e. freedom to undertake its own land appropriations in the Western Hemisphere. So does it sound familiar to the way the North Americans treat the South Americans and so on, the Latin Americans. Anyway, freedom to undertake its own land appropriations in the Western Hemisphere, since there was still wide open spaces of American soil. But, well, actually here he's not even speaking of South America. Even he's still speaking of the Western expansion on the frontier, going west from, obviously, the Europeans landed in the East American continent, and they gradually expanded west. Okay. It is easy to see that the line thus gave the United States freedom to appropriate land on its own behalf, i.e. freedom to undertake its own land processes, since there were still wide open spaces on American soil. But the American posture vis-a-vis old monarchical Europe did not signify a renunciation. The United States continued to belong to the sphere of old European civilization and to what was essentially still the European community of international law. I continue. A first-rate specialist, Bernard Fay, even concluded that the word civilization originated at the beginning of the 19th century and was designed to emphasize the continuity that bound European antiquity with France and the United States. Neither Washington's farewell address nor the Monroe Doctrine was meant to establish an extra-European international law. From the outset, the European impulse was directed much more at being a representative of European civilization and European international law. So this is key, right? This is key. So how do we conceive of the United States? Is it an extension of European civilization, or something totally different, or something new from it? These are the key questions which we need to think about again today, right? Okay, anyway, I'll continue. The Latin American states that arose at the time assumed that they too belonged to the family of European nations and to its community of international law. In the 19th century, American international law textbooks took this claim for granted, even when they were speaking of a specifically American as compared to European international law. Although drawn especially and explicitly to conclude old Europe, the global line of Western Hemisphere can be called anti-European only in a certain sense, but in another sense, and contrary to the moral and cultural claim, it even can be said to embody the free, true, and essential Europe. So again, it's a kind of a question of, okay, so there's an expansion to these colonies, the American continent. Is America a inheritor of European values, of European civilization, or is it even a better expression of it? Is it even this sort of later, expanded moment of it, but it's sort of somehow conducted its own internal political cultural sensibilities in a way in which it actually expands and emphasizes and flourishes within European culture and European civilization to a higher point. That's another argument that could be made. Okay, so I continue. Yet this claim at first was concealed because it was combined with a sharp isolationism. Again, very relevant today. At first glance, the demarcation line of the Western Hemisphere is a line of isolation in a very specific sense. By contrast with the disruptive reyes and the agonal amnesty lines, it represents a completely different third type, namely a line of self-isolation. Okay, so isolation from the European. This is basically what the Monroe Doctrine sort of implied, more than just in a sense of foreign policy, but we could say in a sense of the a transformation of what Schmitt is calling Occidental rationalism. In other words, the transformation of, you could say, the Western consciousness or something like this, as it is affected by these geopolitical transformations, these spatial transformations. Okay, continue. We will focus on the clear and consistent formulations of this type of thinking, which are characteristic to so-called Jefferson line, to the so-called Jefferson line. Given their relation to the proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine, it is sufficient for our purposes to cite two famous statements made on January 2nd, 1812 and August 1812, respectively. August 1820, respectively. In both, hatred of England and a disdain for old Europe are evident. This is really, 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 really relevant, okay, right? Because what's the kind of magosphere and Twitter and Musk doing recently is that it's constantly fixated on Europe and everything that's wrong with Europe and bad about Europe at the moment. It is fixated on, and I've been trying to figure out why this suddenly emerged. I mean, this is very sudden, and this is a very, 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 very good answer. Okay, so given their relation to the proclamation of the Monroe Doctrine, it is sufficient for our purposes. Okay, I said that already. Sorry, I'm repeating myself. Okay, so as I said before, in both hatred of England and disdain for old Europe are evident. Particularly notable is the stand the United States took against England in defense of the European law of the sea. The fate of England is nearly decided, and the present form of her existence is drawing to a close. When our strength will permit us to give the law of our hemisphere, it will be that the meridian of the mid-Atlantic should be the line of demarcation between war and peace, on this side of which no act of hostility should be committed, and the lion and the lamb lie down in peace together. Okay, I'm going to stop for 1 second to just clarify exactly where this quote is coming from, because nice thing about Schmitt is he puts a lot of footnotes in, and this editor puts them on the same page, so I don't have to go all the way to the back of the book to look at it. Thomas Jefferson, letter to Dr. John Crawford, January 2nd, 1812, in the writings of Thomas Jefferson, Definitive Education by Albert L.G. blah, blah, blah. Okay, so basically, this is in a letter that Jefferson wrote in 1812. Okay, I continue. One still can detect clearly something of the character of an amity line. Only America is no longer America no longer is open and the theater of ruthless conflicts in the sense of the 16th and 17th centuries, but rather is a peaceful realm, whereas the rest of the world has become a theater of war, and obviously a war of the others from whom America will remain apart. Okay, so this is very interesting because when America was first founded, it was seen as this crazy place full of cowboys and full of open land and like fighting over open land and fights between the natives and the colonialists, and it's got a crazy place. Like if you wanted to have a real crazy weekend, you'd go over to America. Whereas what happened with the Monroe Doctrine is it was kind of flipped. It was like, no. Okay, so now, and I think at this point, perhaps the kind of experiment of the American society and civilization was maybe advanced enough to the point where maybe it was less chaotic, and they began to see themselves as being this much more civilized, orderly place, peaceful. And then it kind of flipped. Like Europe was then seen as this crazy place full of war and warlords fighting each other. And like you think of 1812, like think of the Napoleonic Wars. It was a time of a lot of conflict and a lot of political turmoil in Europe, and perhaps the Americans were looking at that and going, "Look at those crazy people over there." So then they were sort of reversing the accusation of chaos. The sort of barbarians were now in Europe, and the civilized people were now in America, where before that it was the other way around. Just a side note on this. There's an interesting phenomena which I always observed, which is in Dublin, in Ireland. There's a weird screen in the middle of the city centre. And there's a screen in New York, and these two screens are linked together. It's a big circle. It looks like a portal, actually. It's very magical looking. It's like a portal. And people from Dublin can like wave. Sometimes they do more than wave. Sometimes they take out their genitalia, but or give the finger, or something. So there's a portal basically in Dublin and a portal somewhere in New York. I think it's New York, and people could just it's like live streamed, so people could just any time of day people could just like stare at it and wave and make gestures at people from across the Atlantic. And I've always thought it was funny because I always thought that was basically a way of Irish people to kind of envy Americans, because there's always been this European envy, at least in my lifetime, of the Americans. They have like bigger cars and they have more money and they have, I don't know, like whatever. And there's a kind of way to peer into the Americans and see what they're doing and see what they have and what they look like. And the nature of this peering over, this looking over the Atlantic always changes. In most of my lifetime, it was like Europeans kind of nicely and politely looking over at the Americans, and maybe with a little bit of hidden envy, and then the Americans looking back over politely and maybe with a bit of hidden admiration for our history or something. But this peering over the Atlantic is now taking a different character. So I know it's kind of anecdotal, but it's definitely something that's still there in the sort of consciousness of the division between Europe and America. Okay, I keep reading. What was typical of the old amity lines, their agonal meaning and character, let's scroll down a bit, appears to have been reversed. In 1820, Jefferson wrote, "The day is not distant when we may formally require a meridian of partition through the ocean which separates the two hemispheres, on either side of which no European gun shall ever be heard, nor an American on the other." As in the Monroe Proclamation, the term Western Hemisphere is used in the sense that the United States identifies itself with all countries that morally, culturally, and politically belong to the substance of this hemisphere. Jefferson's ideas should not be exaggerated, but they also should not be ignored if we are to have a clear picture of the essential historical and world political character of such a line of isolation. In terms of the history of ideas, and this is where it gets very philosophical and very interesting here, in terms of the history of ideas, the consciousness of the elect stems from a Calvinist Puritan outlook. So the original settlers were Calvinist Puritans, I think. It proceeds in a deistic and secularized form, and for this reason often becomes even more intense because, of course, the feeling of absolute dependency on God does not become secularized simultaneously. In the last quarter of the 18th century, after the Declaration of Human Rights, 1775, the American feeling of dependency received from France an infusion of new moral powers of a purely mundane and worldly character. Enlightenment philosophers, among them Raynal and Condorcet, I don't know his pronunciation, his French name, had created a new picture of human history. The European conquest of America in the 16th century, i.e., the great land appropriation of American soil that had been justified by Catholics and Protestants alike as a mission of Christian faith, now, from a humanitarian perspective, appeared to have been an inhuman act of atrocity. Again, this is so relevant because what is Trump saying about the Greenland? He was like, well, you guys came here 300, 400 years ago. That doesn't mean, or whatever it was, that doesn't mean you just own the place. And then everyone's looking at him going, like, mate, like, America. Like, what are you talking about? Like, America. Like, America is that. America is like, so the way in which America relates to its own founding is interesting because on some level it's the product of European colonial power, and on the other level it critiques that. It's sort of both, right? It's sort of both at the same time. Like, you can be an African, or you can be an Indian, or you could be Irish and criticize the British, and say, like, you're just a colonialist. And it's kind of like, okay, like, right, okay, agree with that or disagree with that, like, it's consistent. Whereas the Americans have this problem, is like their country is the product of colonialism and they are the product of colonialism. It's impossible without it. It was birthed in it. It was born in that expansion. It was born in that conflict. But they then sort of developed this sort of critique of the Europeans as these horrifically colonial, unenlightened sort of tyrants, right? Okay, I keep reading. It was not difficult to find material in Las Casas. I don't know who Las Casas is. Okay, anyway, the American Bill of Rights was conceived of as a kind of rebirth of humanity, because this is where it gets really, really, really important. I'm just going to scroll down so I don't have to scroll later. So the American Bill of Rights was conceived of as a kind of rebirth of humanity. For the 17th century philosopher Hobbes, America remained a realm of the state of nature, in the sense of a pre-state of a free struggle of egoistic instincts and interests. For Locke, as we have seen, America was also, although in a different sense, at the threshold of civilization and in a state of nature. But toward the end of the 18th century, French Enlightenment philosophers came to view North America as free and independent, as a different type of primitive state, namely the state of nature in Rousseau's sense, i.e., as a land still unspoiled by the corruption of over-civilized Europe. The effect of Benjamin Franklin's sojourn in France was decisive, not only with respect to agreements concluded between France and the United States, 1778, but also with respect to the spiritual brotherhood. Thus, for a second time in European consciousness, America became a sphere of freedom and naturalness, although this time with a positive content. Essentially, the old sense of the global line of struggle was transformed, and the line of isolation acquired positive meaning. Okay, so I'll stop there for a second and comment on that. So, what the meaning of America was a debate among Europeans for probably a long time. I mean, you had this enormous continent that was founded with the colonial expansion, and all these Europeans were going over there, and they were probably going back and telling stories of what's happening. I mean, there's conflicts between the Europeans and the natives. There's all sorts of, it's a big open space. It's a frontier society, at least if you lived anywhere near the frontier. You have this enormously kind of wild and new and sort of open. It's like it's a playground. It's a big open playground, and you can go there and you can, it's like Skyrim. You can go fight some bears in the woods and fight some natives, and it's not really well regulated and well policed, and it's not as orderly as it is in Europe. So you this kind of openness, and this is the kind of spatial vitality of finding an open plane. Spatial vitality, it sort of rebirths, it sort of grows, it sort of allows maybe a sort of freedom from the excessive restraints of more advanced, complicated civilizations. Perhaps Europe was becoming in some sense, kind of over civilized in some sense. Like this was exactly Nietzsche's critique, that the Europeans were becoming over civilized. So you have these debates over, okay, well then what is America? Is it this crazy place of wildness? Is it a state of nature in Hobbesian terms, or can we view America in Rousseauian terms as better because it's more natural, because it hasn't been spoiled by too much civilization? So again, like, it's a philosophical contest of the kind of original identity of America in that context. Yeah. Okay, I keep reading. In political terms, this fundamental isolation created a new special order of the earth. It sought to achieve this by separating a sphere of guaranteed peace and freedom from a sphere of despotism and corruption. So it takes on almost like a political theology, very Schmittian. Obviously, you were reading Schmitt, so it makes sense. A kind of a political theology of redemption and sin, or corruption and despotism, or freedom in more political terms. This American idea of isolation is well known and often discussed. Here we are concerned specifically with its relation to the spatial order of the earth and the structure of international law. If the Western Hemisphere was the unspoiled New World, yet not yet infested with the corruption of the Old World, then of course it had to be in a different situation with respect to international law than was the corrupt Old World, which until then had been the center of the earth, as well as the creator and representative of Euro-Christian international law, of the Jus Publicum Europaeum. If America was the soil upon which the elect had been saved, and where they would live anew, pure form of existence in virginal conditions, then all European claims to American soil were cancelled. American soil. So in this is basically the moment where European expansion, more and more expansion, was sort of like suddenly and quite morally hypocritically sort of like blocked, and it was perceived as corrupting. It wasn't perceived as something which was beneficial and a part of the same continuity. Like, we're Europeans, but we're living in a colony, and there's a big open space, and we're expanding into it, and we're still essentially basically just expanded Europeans. There's a kind of moral transformation that happens at this time, in which suddenly those very same European characteristics that created America to begin with are seen as kind of corruptive, morally lesser, inferior characteristics. So there's a kind of it's almost like a Nietzschean moral transvaluation, which happens with the Monroe doctrine. Is just a transvaluation? It's actually a quite interesting way to put it. The Monroe doctrine as a kind of revolt in moral values in this regard, right? Not exactly in the same way Nietzsche described with slavery, but still in some sort of grandiose long-term civilizational sense, it was a sort of revolt. It was a moment of revolt against an old moral order, in which there was a transvaluation, which is never totally rational, never totally coherent. It's always a little bit hypocritical. in some sense, right? If America was the soil upon which the elected had been given and saved, where they would find a new, blah, blah, blah. Okay, I read that part already. Blah, 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 blah. Okay. As we've seen, the Jus Publicum Europaeum had developed several such soil statutes. Thereafter, American soil would not belong to any soil status that European international law had recognized in the 19th century. Neither soil with no master, and thus open for occupation in the former sense, because so originally that was the former sense. It was the 19th century view was soil. Sorry, that was earlier. The original view was that it was a place that was like soil and no master. It was a kind of wild open place. So it would abandon that assumption. Nor colonial soil, nor European soil as a territory of a European state, nor of a battlefield in the sense of the old amnesty lines, nor of a European sphere of extraterritoriality with consular jurisdiction as in Asian countries. Okay, after this new line was drawn, After this new line was drawn, what was the status of the Western Hemisphere from the point of view of the European order of international law? It was completely extraordinary, even precedented. It would not be too much to say, at least for an extremely consistent opinion, that America was considered to be a refuge of justice and efficiency. The essential significance of this line of the elect lay much more in the fact that that only on American soil did conditions exist whereby meaningful attitudes and habits, law and freedom were possible as a normal situation. In old Europe, where the condition of bondage prevailed, even as a person of good stock and character could become a criminal and transgressor of laws. But in America, the distinction between good and evil, justice and injustice, decent person and criminal was not complicated by false situations and false habits. The deep conviction that the condition of America was normal and pacific, while that of Europe was abnormal and combative, still could be recognized by Melo Franco, 1925, in the League of Nations handling of the problems of minorities. Consequently, the global line was a type of quarantine, of pest control, which cordoned off a contaminated area from a healthy country. This was not as expressly stated in President Monroe's proclamation as it was in Jefferson's declarations, but whoever had the brains to see and the ears to hear could not miss in the wording and phrasing of Monroe's proclamation both the fundamental moral tone of repudiation of the whole political system of the European monarchies and the moral and political significance and mythical power concealed in the American line of separation and isolation. Okay, so I think I'll just keep reading a little bit further. So just to summarize, we have this moral phase in which America is then perceived as somewhere that is in some sense morally pure. It's not corrupted by the old tendencies of old Europe. It is a better set of conditions exist there for the flourishing of democratic values and liberalism and so on and so forth, right? Things which were originally born in old Europe, but were then perceived to be flourishing there better, in which Europe was kind of corroding and corrupting itself and destroying the conditions for the flourishing of its own ideas, we could say. Now you do have to overlook the whole issue here of slavery. Right? This is the big issue. Right? This is really the big issue here, which Schmitt isn't even bringing up. It's kind of like, okay, well, you have slaves though. Like there may still be forms of bondage here, but you got slaves. So I suppose. But anyway, let's keep going. Strangely enough, the term Western Hemisphere was opposed precisely to Europe, the Old West, the Old Occident. It was not opposed to Old Asia or Old Africa, but rather to the Old West. The New West claimed to be the true West, the true Occident, the true Europe. The New West, America, would supersede the Old West would reorientate the old world historical order and would become the center of the earth. The West and all that belonged to it in the moral, civilizing, and political sense of the word, Occident would neither be eliminated or destroyed, nor even dethroned, but displaced. Okay, this is the key of Schmitt's spatial philosophy and his spatial understanding of politics and his spatial understanding of history. Something that we don't have a lot of. We have a lot of temporal understandings of things, but the task of spatial thinking is really open to a lot of participation. There's not a lot of participants in this regard, and this is a very good way of thinking of it. That the transference of the sort of center, the core of Europe, of Western civilization from Europe to America happened at this time in the early 19th century with the Monroe Doctrine and so forth. This transference of the core, America became the center of the world, whereas before that it would have been some European capitals like Berlin, London, Paris, whatever. There was a transference of the center from one place to another. At least the beginning of that. Maybe it didn't happen overnight. It happened over a period of decades, if not as like a century or something. But it occurred with the Monroe Doctrine and with this sort of new shift in geospatial thinking, geopolitical thinking. And again, it sort of reminds me of the thing I was brought up earlier with the weird portal that people look in, which is in Dublin and also in I think it's New York. And there's a kind of reminder. The way I looked at that portal, I was thinking, is this for Americans to look at Europeans, or is this for Europeans to look at Americans? I couldn't figure it out. I was like, well, if it was typical of the late 20th century, it would be so that Europeans could stare at Americans and say, well, you guys have things we don't have and we're sort of jealous of you. And then Europeans to stare back and say, well, yeah, but you have some nice buildings and architecture and nice history museums, something like this. So it's a kind of reciprocal, but it's also slightly American centric, because the real center of the world is being enforced there. It's New York. It's America. But as I'm thinking about these issues, such as Twitter and MAGA and Musk, and the way Americans are now constantly through social media looking at European problems and looking at various issues, immigration or crime and so on, which are, by the way, largely exaggerated. I'm not saying these issues aren't there, but they are largely exaggerated by. I wouldn't say that they're exaggerated exclusively by MAGA, but MAGA has taken this to a certain new level. There's a kind of new level of fixation on Europe, and in the critical and negative sense. And often in a very ignorant sense, because I really get the strong impression these people know very little about, these people that share this content the whole time know very little about European history, have never traveled really or spent much time in Europe and so forth. But nonetheless, there's a sort of fixation on this, and I wonder why this fixation is emerging now. Perhaps it's because America is losing its position as the center of the world. It's losing its, because it's going through a similar moment that Europe has gone through in the past, which is it's losing its position as this unipolar sort of place where everyone wants to be, everyone wants to live, everyone admires them. It's the kind of height and peak of civilization. It's the purest expression of kind of civilizational progress or something. That's changed. People don't look at America that way so much anymore. In the past 10 years, in particular, for various reasons, which I won't go into now, but I've sort of wondered if this fixation on Europe is a sort of cognitive dissonance, nearly, on what's actually going on within the American. It's a coping mechanism, we can nearly say, just to put it in crude psychological terms, for the loss of the American centric center of the world position, which they've had particularly in the late 20th century. Anyway, I keep reading. International law ceased to have its center of gravity in Europe. In old Europe, the center of civilization shifted further west to America, like old Asia and old Africa before her. Old Europe had become the past. Like always, all the new are used here not only in the sense of condemnation, but also and above all in the sense of redistribution of order and orientation. As such, they are the basis of the highest historical, political, and legal claims. They had changed the structure of European international law long before. Since 1890, the inclusion of Asiatic states, most prominently Japan, had expanded the community of European international law into a spaceless, universalist international law. So before, one of Schmitt's complaints he has continuously in this book is that with the European version of the old European version of international law, it was more grounded in a kind of spatial reality. It was specifically European, and it offered a kind of universalistic and a kind of center of the world-ish framework, which people kind of borrowed from, especially during the expansive colonial periods. But it was still sort of grounded more in a more concrete kind of society, basically social order, spatially concrete social order. And then as time goes by, particularly with these various expansions, you start to get a sort of spatially confused order, and we still have that today. I mean, if you think of like something like BRICS, well, first of all, if you think of the post-war international order, actually, or even the League of Nations, which emerged after World War One, or as a response to World War One. You know, it sort of has this conglomerate of different countries from all around the world, and no one's really sure, like, what do any of these places have in common? Like, with Europe, there's a very concrete and old kind of anthropological commonality between language, between religion, between ethnicity, between geographical space. There's a sort of culture, there's a sort of concrete historical reality, but then you kind of have the League of Nations, and it's like this country and that country, and Asia and Africa and Europe and blah 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 blah. And it kind of loses its orientation. It loses kind of centrifugal force. Is displaced onto an array of different places. And the same thing goes for this BRICS project, which the Russians initiated between Russia, China, South Africa, Brazil, all these countries, India, whatever. It's like, what's the kind of centrifugal force here which is holding it all together? Where's the sort of backdrop, the anthropological history, the concrete social spatial order? There isn't really. It's kind of just a bunch of groups that were fed up with NATO and fed up with the US that got together and formed a group. I mean, it's why I'm suspicious that this group will have a lasting future, because it seems very despatialized, just like the 20th century American centric models of spatial order were very decentralized, and so on and so forth. Anyway, I keep reading. We are not concerned with the extent to which the claims of Jefferson and Monroe were morally or politically justified, or to that extent their conviction that they represented a morally or politically new world made a good sense. But a piece of European culture, in fact, had found a home and had prospered on American soil. Europeans of old Europe must acknowledge the fact that men like George Washington and Simon Bolivar were great Europeans. And even that they came closer to realizing the ideal meaning of Europe than most British and continental European statesmen of their time. Moreover, given the parliamentary corruption of the English and the absolutist degeneration of the French in the 18th century, and given the narrowness and constraints of the post-Napoleonic Restoration and the Metternichian, I don't know what he means by this, reaction of the, I know I could Google it, but I'm lazy. Metternichian reaction of the 19th century, America had great possibilities to represent the tried and true Europe. Okay, so this book was written in 1950. So Schmitt is, I think he is a sort of loyalist to the old Europe, but he does bring up a question of that America did sort of represent a possibility to actualize older European cultural inclinations and political ideals to a higher degree, and that Europe went through a long period of problems, all the way pretty much from, say, let's say the late 18th century until like the mid 20th century. It went through a long period of a lot of difficulty. Um, and that is a good question, of course. Now, the reason I brought this up in relation to explaining the contemporary European and American relations is because what's happening at the moment is that more and more Europeans, and perhaps a lot of Americans too, no longer feel like America really is. I think after World War II, in particular, until very recently, most people in the West did feel like the US was a good and legitimate inheritor of older European values and civilizational ideals. And it had their own peculiarities and their own peculiar inclinations and so forth. And, I think a lot of people in Europe most people were very critical of things like, maybe things like, at least in recent times, things like, the death penalty in certain states, or things like the maybe excessively kind of liberal capitalistic tendencies to not even have healthcare or something like this, right? But still, a few things here and there could be reformed and improved, and most Europeans and a lot of Americans too would consider America a kind of legitimate inheritor of those older values. But can we say that anymore? Has the history of the past few decades just slowly, I don't think it happened just with Trump. I think this was happening slowly over time. I think this probably began with 9/11, and then with the war on terror, and then the financial crash and all these other things which have kind of built up. But the question, of course, is that still true? Are they any longer an inheritor of these older European ideals and values? And are we seeing a inflammation of the tensions between Europe and the United States exactly because we are going through another huge shift in the nomos of the earth? We're going through another shift from this kind of American-centric unipolar world to a multipolar world. And there's, for various other reasons too, to do with, I think, internal problems in the United States, internal contradictions, internal issues, that we're going through a kind of break, and that's inflamed these tensions once again.